Bitterroot Range, Montana Territory. February 1891. The wind carried death that winter. Temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Altitudes where even experienced trappers turned back. Yet one man, ridiculed for his wasteful methods, stumbled upon something that would rewrite survival doctrine across the northern Rockies. Elias Drummond wasn't a scientist. He wasn't an engineer. He was a 52-year-old hunter who made what everyone called a stupid mistake during a moment of exhaustion. A mistake that generated 23 degrees more warmth than conventional shelters, using the same amount of fuel. What did this Montana trapper accidentally discover that contradicted every established wilderness survival practice of his time? Before we reveal how a moment of desperate improvisation became a life-saving technique taught across 3 states, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Comment below with where you're watching from, because what saved lives in 1891 Montana might save yours today. And if you value this forgotten survival wisdom, smash that like button. The algorithm needs to know that history's most practical lessons deserve to be seen. Elias Drummond had spent 27 winters in the Bitterroot Range. He knew the rhythms of mountain cold the way a musician knows scales. Knew which ridgelines held game when valleys froze. Knew how to read cloud formations 3 days before a storm arrived. Knew exactly how much firewood a night required at 8,000 feet elevation. February 12, 1891, he knew he'd made a critical miscalculation. The elk he'd been tracking for 4 days had led him 43 miles northwest of Stevensville, deeper into the Bitterroots than he'd ventured in 5 years. When the weather turned, it turned viciously. What had been clear morning skies became a whiteout by noon. Wind speeds that transformed moderate cold into flesh-freezing exposure. The temperature dropped from 18 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn to -4 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-afternoon, and the barometric pressure suggested it would plunge further. Drummond's standard procedure, the lean-to shelter with reflector fire that had served him reliably for nearly 3 decades, suddenly felt inadequate. He'd built it expertly, 8-foot spruce logs forming a 45-degree angle back wall, fire positioned 6 feet in front, flat stones behind the flames to radiate heat inward. Textbook frontier technique. By midnight, he was shivering violently despite a roaring fire consuming wood at an alarming rate. His leather gloves, hung to dry near the flames, remained stiff with ice. The shelter's interior measured perhaps 34 degrees Fahrenheit, while he burned through fuel reserves he'd allocated for 3 nights. Outside, the thermometer he kept in his pack read -11 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind drove cold through every gap in his construction. His fingers showed the white patches that preceded frostbite. His fuel supply would last perhaps 2 more nights at this consumption rate. The settlement was 4 days away in good conditions. These are not good conditions. Experienced trappers understood a fundamental truth. In extreme cold, shelter efficiency meant the difference between survival and a spring thaw revealing your frozen body. Drummond had built hundreds of camps. He knew the techniques. Yet tonight, those techniques were failing and the temperature was still dropping. Exhaustion makes fools of careful men. At 2 a.m., February 13th, Drummond's judgment fractured under cold and fatigue. His fire demanded constant feeding. His woodpile shrank. His body shook. And in a moment of desperate, muddled thinking, he did something that violated every principle of efficient frontier camping. He began packing snow, dense, heavy, wet snow, into a wall directly behind his fire. Not a snow cave, not a windbreak positioned away from flames. He built a curved wall of compacted snow 18 inches thick, rising 4 feet high, positioned just 30 inches behind his firebox. Then, still half delirious with cold, he extended the wall around both sides, creating a U-shaped enclosure with the open end facing his lean-to. He used his axe to cut and stack snow blocks like a demented mason, working for 90 minutes in -14 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures. Every trapper in Montana Territory would have called it wasteful idiocy. Snow near fire melts. Melting means constant reconstruction. Worse, it meant working in freezing temperatures instead of conserving warmth. You positioned fire reflectors, stone or metal, behind flames to throw heat forward. You never used a material that absorbed heat through phase change, that fought against the very warmth you were trying to maintain. Drummond knew this, had known it for 27 years, but exhaustion and cold had stripped away judgment, leaving only an animal instinct to build walls around warmth. He finished the snow barrier at 3:30 a.m., soaked with melted snow, colder than when he'd started. He collapsed onto his bedroll, expecting to wake frozen. He woke at dawn sweating. The shelter's interior temperature had climbed to 57 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit. His fire had burned down to coals, yet heat radiated from every direction. The snow wall behind his fire pit glowed with warmth, its inner surface glazed into a smooth ice shell that reflected heat like a curved mirror. The U-shaped enclosure trapped rising warmth, preventing wind from stealing it. His fuel consumption had dropped to perhaps 40% of the previous night's rate. Drummond sat upright, staring at the impossible thermometer reading. His fingers showed no frostbite progression. His clothes, hung to dry, were completely moisture-free. His water bottle, typically frozen solid by morning, remained liquid. What in God's name had he done? Drummond was not a stupid man. Survival at high altitude demanded intellectual rigor alongside physical endurance. For the next 4 days, trapped by continued storms, he methodically documented his accidental discovery. He tested variables. He measured. He observed. The snow wall hadn't simply melted away as conventional wisdom predicted. Instead, the heat from his fire had transformed the inner 6 inches into a shell of dense, crystalline ice while the outer 12 inches remained insulating snow. This created a two-phase barrier. The ice surface absorbed infrared radiation from the flames, then radiated it back across a longer wavelength, flooding the enclosed space with gentle, persistent warmth. The snow layer behind the ice prevented heat loss to the outside air. He'd accidentally created what modern engineers would call a thermal mass radiant heater with integrated insulation. Traditional reflector walls, stone or metal positioned behind fires, worked through direct reflection. They bounced heat forward efficiently, but had minimal thermal mass. They cooled within minutes after flames died. Drummond's ice wall, however, absorbed heat continuously while the fire burned, then released it gradually for hours afterward. On the night of February 16th, he let his fire die completely at midnight. His thermometer showed the shelter interior at 51 degrees Fahrenheit. By 6 a.m., it had dropped to only 39 degrees Fahrenheit, a mere 12-degree loss over 6 hours, despite outside temperatures of minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. The curved U-shape proved equally critical. It prevented convective heat loss, the process where warm air rises and escapes, pulling cold air in to replace it. Standard lean-to shelters bled warmth upward continuously. Drummond's enclosure trapped that rising heat, creating a warm air reservoir that maintained temperature even as the fire cycled between active burning and coals. He calculated his fuel consumption, approximately 60 pounds of wood per night, compared to the 110 pounds he'd burned using conventional methods in equivalent conditions. Nearly 50% reduction. The labor investment in building the snow wall, 90 minutes of hard work, returned dividends every hour for 4 consecutive nights. Physics he couldn't name but could measure. Specific heat capacity of ice, radiant heat transfer, convective suppression, phase change thermal regulation. Drummond recorded observations in his journal with the precision of an engineer, though he lacked the vocabulary to explain why it worked. He knew only that it did work, measurably and repeatedly. January 28, 1892, the night that would validate or destroy Drummond's credibility. 11 months after his accidental discovery, winter delivered the coldest temperatures recorded in Montana Territory history. A high-pressure system stalled over the Bitterroots, creating crystalline skies and brutal radiative cooling. By sunset, thermometers across the region showed minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, minus 32 degrees Fahrenheit. By 3 a.m., minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills approaching minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Drummond had spent those 11 months refining his technique. He'd tested different wall thicknesses, angles, and heights. He'd documented optimal fire distances from the ice barrier. 30 to 36 inches worked best, close enough for radiant efficiency, far enough to prevent rapid melting. He'd learned to intentionally create the ice shell by building an initial hot fire, melting and refreezing the inner snow surface before settling into maintenance burning. But he'd never tested it at minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Nobody had, because nobody in a Montana trapping community took his snow oven seriously. Samuel Whitmore did. Whitmore, a 28-year-old trapper working the same ridgelines as Drummond, had dismissed the technique as old man eccentricity until persistent curiosity drove him to try it in December. Now, on the coldest night in territorial history, both men maintained camps 3 miles apart, each using Drummond's method. 17 other trappers working the Bitterroots that week used conventional shelters. Standard lean-tos with reflector fires. Proven techniques passed down through generations. Methods that had kept men alive through countless winters. By dawn on January 29th, 3 trappers had suffered severe frostbite requiring eventual amputation. 7 more abandoned their camps in the night, undertaking dangerous forced marches to lower elevations. 2 men, experienced veterans, died of exposure before rescue parties found them on January 30th. Drummond woke at sunrise in a shelter measuring 61 degrees Fahrenheit internal temperature. Whitmore's camp, checked later that day, had maintained 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Both men had slept comfortably under single blankets. Both had consumed approximately 70 pounds of firewood, less than half what desperate men in conventional shelters had burned through before abandoning their camps. The temperature differential was undeniable. In equivalent conditions, at equivalent elevations, Drummond's modified technique maintained interior temperatures 27 to 31 degrees warmer than standard frontier methods, while consuming 40 to 50% less fuel. The bodies changed everything. On February 3, 1892, when search parties recovered Thomas McKenna and Jacob Hartwell, both frozen in shelters built according to established best practices, the Montana trapping community stopped laughing at Elias Drummond's snow oven. Drummond returned to Stevensville on February 7th with Samuel Whitmore. They brought documentation, journal entries with temperature readings, fuel consumption calculations, timeline logs showing hour-by-hour thermal performance during the January 28th cold snap. Most convincingly, they brought their physical condition: no frostbite, no weight loss from caloric depletion fighting cold, no equipment damage from desperate overfiring. The Bitterroot Saloon became an impromptu engineering forum. 23 trappers, guides, and timber scouts gathered on February 9th as Drummond sketched his technique on butcher paper. The skepticism was immediate and vocal. Snow melts, objected Henry Caulfield, a 46-year-old trapper with 2 decades of mountain experience. You're fighting thermodynamics. Waste of labor and fuel. Drummond had anticipated this. Build it hot first. Intentional melt and refreeze creates the ice shell. After that, maintenance fire, not a raging burn, keeps it stable. The ice doesn't fight you. It works for you. Stores heat, releases it slow. Curved wall blocks wind, added Whitmore. Standard lean-to bleeds warmth upward. This traps it. Physics, not magic. Martin Schaefer, a German immigrant who supplied the trading post, raised the critical question. Fuel savings you're claiming, 60 pounds versus 110 pounds per night. That's specific. You measured. For months of documentation, Drummond replied. 12 separate camps, temperatures ranging minus 8 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Average reduction, 47% less wood for equivalent or better warmth. I can show you the logs. The gathering demanded proof beyond journals. On February 12, 1892, exactly 1 year after Drummond's initial accidental discovery, the community organized a comparative test. 3 shelters built at 7,200 feet elevation, 2 miles from town. Shelter A, Traditional lean-to with stone reflector. Shelter B. Drummond's snow wall method. Shelter C. Hybrid approach suggested by Caulfield, using banked coals instead of active fire. Temperature that night, -19 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind, 15 to 20 miles per hour from the northwest. Each shelter received identical firewood allocation, 75 pounds. 3 volunteers rotated through 2-hour observation shifts in each structure, recording temperatures hourly from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. Results documented by Martin Schaefer, who maintained neutrality as test administrator. Shelter A. Average interior temperature 37 degrees Fahrenheit. Fuel exhausted by 4:30 a.m. Final temperature 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Shelter B. Drummond method average interior temperature 59 degrees Fahrenheit. 18 pounds fuel remaining at dawn. Final temperature 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Shelter C. Average interior temperature 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Fuel exhausted by 5 a.m. Final temperature 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The 22-degree average temperature advantage was irrefutable. By late February 1892, 11 trappers had adopted Drummond's technique for high-altitude winter camps. By the end of the 1892 to 1893 winter season, that number had grown to 37 across Montana Territory and northern Idaho. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company, which lost significant revenue when trappers abandoned camps due to extreme cold, began including ice wall shelter construction in training materials for new hires in 1893. Regional newspapers picked up the story in March 1893. The Helena Independent ran a feature titled "Montana Trappers' Accidental Discovery Saves Lives," which spread the technique to Wyoming and Colorado. Forest Service records from 1894 to 1896 show a measurable decrease in cold weather emergency rescues in regions where Drummond's method had been adopted, a 34% reduction compared to the previous 3-year period. Samuel Whitmore, who became the technique's most vocal advocate, told the Missoula Gazette in 1895, "Elias didn't invent physics. He stumbled into applying it correctly. The old-timers taught us stone reflectors because stone was what they knew. Elias showed us ice does it better in cold climates. It's not revolutionary. It's just correct." By 1897, variations of the snow wall shelter appeared in military winter survival manuals. The U.S. Army's Rocky Mountain training operations incorporated it into cold weather doctrine. What began as an exhausted man's desperate mistake had become institutionalized knowledge, validated by measurable outcomes and documented lives saved. The technique spread because it worked. It worked because the physics, thermal mass, radiant heat storage, convective suppression operated independently of belief or tradition. Drummond hadn't discovered new science. He'd accidentally assembled existing principles into a configuration that previous generations had never tested, perhaps because it seemed counterintuitive, perhaps because "we've always done it this way" calcified into unexamined doctrine. Elias Drummond died in 1904 at age 65, not from cold, but from pneumonia contracted during an autumn hunt. His obituary in the Stevensville Register mentioned his trapping career, but made no reference to the thermal shelter technique that bore his unofficial name across 3 states. History often forgets the practical innovators, remembering instead the men who wrote about innovations in academic journals. Yet the technique survived him. By the 1920s, mountaineering guides in the Rockies taught ice wall bivouacs as standard cold weather emergency protocol. The Boy Scouts of America included simplified versions in winter camping curricula by 1935. Military survival schools, particularly those training personnel for Arctic and alpine operations, refined Drummond's empirical observations into engineered specifications. Modern thermodynamic analysis explains precisely why it worked. Ice has a specific heat capacity of 2.09 kJ/kg degree C and a thermal conductivity of 2.22 W/m degree K. When formed into an 18-inch thick wall with a glazed inner surface, it creates a thermal battery, absorbing infrared radiation during active burning, storing approximately 12,000 BTUs in a standard U-shaped configuration. then releasing that energy gradually through long-wave radiation over 6 to 8 hours. The outer snow layer, with thermal conductivity near 0.05 to 0.10 W/m degree K, provides insulation preventing heat loss to ambient air. The curved geometry generates what engineers call a radiant heat trap. Infrared energy bounces between the fire, the ice surface, and the occupant, multiplying effective heat transfer compared to linear reflection. Modern infrared cameras demonstrate this visually. Conventional lean-tos show heat plumes escaping upward and laterally. Drummond-style enclosures show heat concentrated and circulating within the shelter volume. Contemporary wilderness survival instructors, those operating in regions with reliable snow cover, still teach variations of the technique. Dave Canterbury's Pathfinder School in Ohio includes ice wall construction in advanced winter modules. The National Outdoor Leadership School, NOLS, documents it in their winter camping curriculum, noting it as historically proven, thermodynamically sound, labor-intensive but fuel-efficient. The principle has influenced modern emergency shelter design. Mylar emergency bivouacs operate on similar radiant heat reflection principles. Military cold weather tents increasingly incorporate thermal mass elements, water bladders, sand-filled barriers that store and release heat, echoing Drummond's accidental discovery that mass matters as much as insulation. Yet the technique remains underutilized relative to its effectiveness, perhaps because it contradicts intuition. Snow near fire still seems wasteful to those who haven't tested it. The labor investment, 90 minutes of cold, exhausting work, feels prohibitive compared to faster shelter methods. Modern materials, synthetic sleeping bags rated to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, portable propane heaters, insulated tents, allow people to avoid the problem Drummond solved rather than apply his solution. That's acceptable for recreational camping. It becomes critical during emergencies, unexpected weather, equipment failure, injury preventing movement. In those scenarios, knowing that 18 inches of compacted snow can generate a 25 to 30 degree temperature advantage using 50% less fuel might mean the difference between survival and hypothermia. The deeper lesson transcends shelter construction. Drummond's mistake revealed how easily assumptions calcify into doctrine. Stone reflectors worked, so stone reflectors became the method. For decades, experienced trappers taught that technique without testing whether alternatives might work better under specific conditions. It required an exhausted man, stripped of conventional judgment by cold and desperation, to accidentally discover that their proven method was suboptimal. This pattern repeats throughout history. Traditional knowledge often contains profound wisdom, but sometimes tradition simply means we've never questioned this assumption. Drummond's legacy isn't just a shelter technique. It's a reminder that empirical testing, measuring, comparing, documenting, reveals truth more reliably than authority or longevity. The January 1892 cold snap killed 2 experienced men using accepted methods. Drummond survived using a method everyone called foolish until measurements proved otherwise. That's the asymmetry of innovation. Mockery costs nothing, but being wrong about survival costs everything. Before you go, make sure you've subscribed. This channel is dedicated to uncovering practical wisdom that modern convenience has buried. Hit that like button if you value knowledge that actually works when it matters. And comment below. Where are you watching from, and what's the coldest temperature you've personally survived? The community wants to know your stories. Drummond's ice wall worked because physics doesn't care about tradition. Neither does cold. Neither should you when your life depends on warmth.